Hello and welcome everyone to the 30 Days of Forgiveness. Today I'm having a conversation about forgiving life circumstances. Now, this is the third of a series of conversations that I've had with Rose. She is a radical forgiveness master coach. She was personally trained by Colin Tipping, who is the founder of Radical Forgiveness, and that will really be the framework that we use for this discussion. So, Rose, is there anything else that you want to add before we launch into this very deep and very wide topic of forgiving life circumstances?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, as you say, it's a huge topic, and
Mm-hmm.
the other two videos we did will kind of maybe prepare the ground for the context of forgiving life circumstances. So if people haven't already watched those, it would be recommended just to give a context. But they are big topics, and I will present this mainly from obviously the perspective of radical forgiveness and also my own life circumstances. But when with radical forgiveness, we always say when we present a concept, especially in this particular area, that it's enough to be willing to be open to the possibility of the way we're looking at it. It's not that you have to believe in a particular philosophy or be subscribed to a kind of a particular way of viewing things. We just ask people maybe to be open to the possibility and to always trust yourself. And the other side of this as well, another aspect of this, is that the tools will work for people even if you're skeptical, which is actually really good. If you're the only willingness we kind of suggest people have is the willingness to do the tools. You don't have to be willing to subscribe to the bigger picture of what we present. That if it fits in with your worldview, fine. If it doesn't, that's fine too. It may expand your worldview, and so there is that freedom. And in some of the tools, maybe not so much the one we're doing online, but in some of the other tools, you don't have to sort of, if, for example, in the worksheet, you might be asked if you're willing or skeptical or unwilling to accept a particular phrase. And, if you're unwilling or skeptical, you can be honest and say that's how you're feeling. So the only willingness is the willingness to actually do a process. So just to point that out. Okay.
Awesome. So I actually sat down this morning and I was just writing out all of the different quote unquote life circumstances, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
one we're born into, whether it's the economic or cultural or familial situations we're born into or we're raised in. Was just
Mm-hmm.
thinking about natural disasters, um, the loss of a loved one, loss of a relationship, divorce, and just quickly look at my notes. So it's just illness or emergencies that pop up, economic crises, the political things that are going on in
Mm-hmm.
our life,
Mm-hmm.
economic recessions, downturn in our businesses or in the business that we work for. Traveling has been one of the biggest, like, whoa, for me. It's, going into a foreign country that speaks a different language, has a different cultural um, set of rules. There's so many things that encompass life circumstances, and in particular difficult life
Mm-hmm.
circumstances. So I thought I would just start there. If you have any thoughts about what people can do from a radical forgiveness standpoint, if they find themselves in any of the difficult circumstances that I described, or even something that I haven't thought
Yeah, well, you've covered quite a range there.
of. Yeah, I
I
didn't
think,
even say all of
I
them I
think,
have written
well
down.
done.
So
Yeah, I mean, most of us, I'm sure most people listening to this will have experienced at least a few of the ones that you
mm-hmm.
mentioned. I'm not sure that anybody has a completely smooth ride through life. And if you remember what we suggested, and again, it's a suggestion to be open to the possibility that things happen for a reason. And sometimes it can be easier to see that in terms of our personal lives. So some of the challenges you mentioned were personal challenges, and then you also mentioned more, if you like, more global ones or
Mm-hmm.
political situations. So if we look first at the personal ones, um, remember in the first conversation we said that it's easier in retrospect to look back at something that happened and see, maybe that happened for a reason because I learned from it, or it maybe pushed me towards my life, maybe it guided me towards my life's work. That could be somebody, for example, who's grown up in either an abusive or an addictive household or in a very difficult neighborhood. And some people may kind of just not be able to handle that. But then we always hear stories where people, that's actually been the catalyst for them to grow and also to find what their work is about. So when we look back at situations, we can sometimes see maybe that happened for a reason. I was just listening to today, actually in the car, to a wonderful lady called Chloe Goodchild, who's done a lot of work with sound. And in her sound work, she emphasizes the importance of silence. And she was telling her the story that at the age of 4, she had a tonsil operation which went wrong, or something happened in the tonsil operation. And for 3 years, she was deaf. So in those 3 years, she became very familiar with silence and with kind of feeling sound rather than being able to hear it. And then she got her hearing back. But she credits those 3 years of enforced silence on the human level to her work that she does now. And, from the radical forgiveness, the bigger perspective, we might say that maybe that had a purpose. So it might have seemed like a crisis at the time. I'm sure to her parents it did, but it actually would have been the motivator and would have helped her to the depth of the work she does now. So sometimes when we look back on our own life or lives of people we know, sometimes if people get a serious illness, like maybe cancer, then it can be the catalyst for them to look after themselves better, to gain greater wisdom. I have a friend in Scandinavia who got cancer, and she actually wrote a book called Cancer is Wisdom, because she's writing about the wisdom and the teacher that cancer was for her. And now her work is actually to reach out to other people. And it isn't just about cancer, it's about any illness or any crisis. So when it's on a personal level, when we look back, or if we have the ability to see that maybe there's something in this that is actually important for me in terms of my soul's growth. Now, initially, it might not be easy to see that. And if people like what we've done so far with radical forgiveness, and if they do have either an illness or a handicap or a really difficult life situation, they can do radical forgiveness on that. You could do radical forgiveness on your illness, on your cancer or on your arthritis or on your bankruptcy or whatever it might be. All right. Just forgiving the situation and maybe beginning to see where, in terms of, if you remember the last few times we were talking about the idea that maybe we are living out a drama that we have created for ourselves. It's very real in one level, but on another level, it's been created by our soul, our higher self, or whatever, for our growth and for our going more and more towards our life purpose. And from that perspective, these situations may actually be very, very important turning points in our life. So, I think personally, now it's not easy depending on the circumstance. I mean, it's not easy to see that in terms of, say, abuse or really tough situations that people have. So it's more to be willing to be open to that possibility that maybe something else is going on, that we are learning, or that the people we're involved with are learning, that we are teachers for each other. So it isn't always easy to acknowledge it, but when we, if all of this is very difficult for people to take on, but they like the paradigm, you could start with the easier things first. The easier things in your life. And then gradually you may find that it's easier to look at these situations. When people work with a coach, say when I work with people who may have very deep issues, for example, with very difficult childhoods, and honestly, I don't know if anybody has a really straightforward childhood. Okay. I'm not so sure that in terms of our spiritual growth, if we had a really smooth childhood, whether we would grow. But if we've had very, very deep issues with parents or with siblings, then usually by the time we finish a certain set of processes, they can actually see that the neglected mother or the emotionally unavailable father or whatever the situation was, that of course it wasn't pleasant, but they begin to understand that because those situations happened in my childhood, I learned strength or I learned compassion. And quite often they end up actually feeling compassion for the parent that before that they were feeling very angry with. Now, it's not condoning if the parent did something that's very inappropriate. And there are situations where, if it was abuse or if it was, um, embezzlement of money or any of those really serious situations where we still may need to go through the legal process or, call on the authorities. So, as I said in the first interview, when we're doing the radical forgiveness work, it's not condoning what somebody did. And if there is, on the human level, something that is obviously, seriously either illegal or unethical, then we do have the right and sometimes the responsibility to deal with it in terms of authorities. But we're actually better able to handle it when we're not all charged up emotionally. Okay, so that's just one aspect. Is there any other aspect of it that if you think
Gosh,
of a
I've
specific
just been sitting
example?
here as you've been talking, and there's so many places I want to go from
Yeah.
here. Um, so is it okay if we just move on to something else? Because I just realized you've asked me a question and my thoughts were elsewhere.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, because it may come up as we go along. Okay.
Perfect. I was just thinking about um, looking in our life for patterns. Like this is something that the radical forgiveness coach Brenda Reese had brought up, and she was looking, in particular, she was looking at her relationships with men. But I'm thinking even more deeply about the kinds of life circumstances that we had growing up. For example, and I'm going to be projecting a little bit. I'm an entrepreneur. My
Mm-hmm.
parents were not, but I'm just thinking about people that I've talked to who were raised in entrepreneurial households,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the patterns that they said they experienced growing up was the feast or famine. So there were
Mm-hmm.
times when their parents were doing well economically, and then times when things were really bad. And of course, it's very stressful for especially young parents to go through when they have a family to feed. So these kinds of patterns that we see in our life, irrespective of whether they're in our relationships or in our life circumstances, or, for example, when I was a chiropractor, I treated a lady for a car accident. And literally within a span of 2 years, she had had 4 car accidents. She came into
Mm-hmm.
me every single time. And I remember talking to the attorney that she was working with and saying, how often does this happen that a person continuously gets into car accidents? And he said it happens a lot more than you
Mm-hmm.
realize. And
Mm-hmm.
so I could go on and on about the kinds of patterns that people see show up in their
Mm-hmm.
life, but I'm curious from a radical forgiveness perspective, as well as just a way that we can start to pay attention to the kinds of
Yeah.
things that happen in our life. Um, is this happening for a reason? Is this something the universe wants to pique our interest in so that we can learn and grow? Or what thoughts do you have about starting to pay
Yeah.
attention to these patterns that show up?
Absolutely. And I would certainly agree with the person who told you that this sort of thing happens more often than we actually realize. And I mean, actually, one of the first steps, and it's a big one actually, is when people begin to see that there might be a pattern. All right. Now, sometimes people can say, why does this always happen to me? But
Mm-hmm.
then at a certain point, we might begin to realize in a better way, like we can say, why does this always happen to me? As if we're at the mercy of the universe, if you like. But then we might think, why is this always happening? So even that step of beginning to realize that there's a pattern here. And so it very often happens, as you say, in relationships. I remember I was listening to, Pema Chodron, for whom I have great respect. She's a Buddhist teacher, and she was talking about this, the idea of patterns as well. And she said that she had a friend who was helping this young woman who had been in a very abusive relationship, a romantic relationship, and very possibly from family as well. And this woman, Pema's friend, decided she'd help this young woman, and she brought her out of the city area she was living in and got her to live in a very quiet, safe community, got her work, set her up with work. But actually, within a few months, this young woman was again in an abusive relationship because, in a sense, it was like what she knew, it was what she was
Mm-hmm.
familiar with. And it's almost in Ireland, we have an expression. I don't know if you know this one: the devil you know is the better than the devil you don't know. Do you know that expression?
I've heard of it, but it's not something that we
Right. Well,
use
in Ireland, we
commonly.
say the devil you know. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And in a strange way, when we're familiar with any of these dynamics like abuse or arguing or anger, in a strange way, they're familiar to us. And so even though they're not, we may say we don't like them, we feel at home in them in a kind of an unusual kind of way. All right. So in radical forgiveness, when we do particularly the worksheets or the other processes, we begin to see, say if it was relationships, because it's easier to see there, we might say, well, has this happened before with other? Have I experienced this kind of feeling before, or this kind of situation? And what that helps to begin us to see, to help us to see, is that the person the person who is the one I am blaming for my feelings right now. Now, of course, their actions may not be appropriate, but the person I'm blaming, then I begin to realize, well, the same thing happened with the last one and maybe one before. And then you may even begin to realize that this kind of energy dynamic, if that makes sense, the sort of whatever's happening there, the sense of betrayal or the lack of power or one person controlling another, whatever it is, that you might begin to see that that didn't just happen in romantic relationships. It may happen in your family, it may happen in your friendships, or it may happen at work. So you may begin to see that there's a recurring pattern in your life. And even being able to see that, for one thing, it helps to not put so much pressure on the person who's playing the role at present. You begin to realize, well, it's not just about him or her, okay? That it's also something in me. So in the worksheets, we do that the recurring patterns, we begin to see the recurring patterns. So if it were somebody, for example, who was constantly having accidents, then we might look at, well, this keeps happening, and maybe kind of begin to look at maybe the emotional, like, maybe is there something like the world isn't safe? Do they have a core negative belief around that? Or something, it could be something in that line, begin to see what underlies the constant sort of accidents. I mean, maybe it's not being aware, maybe it's not being mindful. Maybe it's a kind of, because in the two processes we've done, there's mention of the word addiction to being a victim. Now, at some level, we can be addicted to our patterns because they feel familiar. All right, they feel comfortable in a weird way. And then there is also the thing, if people have, I don't mean necessarily always having accidents or always having particular situations, but sometimes we can be very comfortable and like the attention or like the drama that it creates. Or it could be, for example, if we're constantly having accidents or illness, not always, it may help us to get attention.
Or even,
I mean, there can be
because
support,
this lady,
absolutely.
The accidents weren't her fault, so it wasn't. I mean, maybe she was a bad driver. I don't know, but it wasn't like she was the cause of them. They were happening.
Yeah.
They were happening to her. But I did notice that the only time she really took care of herself was when somebody could care for her, and so I kind of wondered if part of her pattern was, if she got into an accident, then she would have some reason to care for herself, because she was always caring for everybody else and just like a lovely, wonderful woman, but I could tell that she really wasn't getting the support that she needed by asking for it. So maybe she was creating some sort of situation where she could ask for it in a way that felt comfortable for her. So
that's actually very likely. All right. And when, because I think we all do this sometimes, when there is a comfort sometimes in being sick. I don't mean obviously not seriously ill, but, but children do this sometimes, to get attention. And sometimes they're genuinely ill, but there's a comfort when you are classified as sick and then everybody else can take care of you. So, it's not necessarily psychoanalyzing this lady because we don't know, but when we're doing the processes, we might begin to see that, okay, I've had 4 accidents. And they gave me the permission to look after myself and to allow other people to help me. And maybe then we might see, well, maybe it's to show me where I'm not caring for myself, and give myself permission. And is there any other way I can both be of service to other people, but also look after my own needs. So sometimes it can be around that, and it can be quite a wake-up call for people to realize that, you know, that we don't may not have to create such a drama in order to get our needs met. You know,
Well, it's
a
just
big one.
perfect because that's the current series that I'm working on is exploring and expressing your needs. So I love that you're bringing this up because it really is concurrent with what I'm working on personally right now. So
Yeah. And you know, it's particularly common, I think, with people who have a natural caregiver
mm-hmm.
energy or even a rescuer energy, where, because how I can speak with such authority as I have it myself. And I've had to learn. And again, I think a lot of cultural conditioning can be there. I think particularly for women, some men, it can be for men as well. But, you know, the archetypal kind of cultural thing around women being looking after everybody else and not looking after themselves. The kind of martyr energy that can be
Mm-hmm.
in there as well. I've had that, and it's taken me quite a long time to sort of realize that, you know, exhausting ourselves in the service of others isn't, for one thing, it's not helping ourselves, but it may not actually be helping them, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes it makes people people won't necessarily take responsibility for themselves if they know that you're going to do it for them, you know. So I think there's a lot about, you know, feeling that we are worthy to look after ourselves and that our worth is equal to that of others. So, I mean, that example of the accidents, or I think many of us could think of examples in our lives where that is often one of the core energies that we're working on is genuine self-love. Um, it's a very good example. Yeah.
So I'm curious then what can people do to start to look at these patterns? Are there processes in radical forgiveness or a worksheet that people can start to
Hmm.
look at potential
Yeah,
patterns they can work on?
absolutely there are. I mean, I would recommend, I don't have it here, but I showed it the other day for people to actually read Colin Tipping's book because
Mm-hmm.
he does describe these very well. Now, on his website, and I would recommend people to visit the Radical Forgiveness website, there are many, many free things you can download. I think sometimes you have to sign up for some of them, but then you can actually download freely. And there are worksheets for everything we've covered and many others. There's a worksheet, for example, for radical forgiveness. There's one for self-forgiveness. There's one for manifestation. There's one for self-acceptance. There's several of them. And in the worksheets, we go through again those 5 stages that I mentioned in the first conversation. And what you do in the worksheets is you write down in the spaces provided the answers to the various questions. And as you go through the worksheet, if you remember, I said that the third stage is what we call collapsing the story, which is when we've acknowledged and expressed our victim story, where we are at the moment, and we've allowed ourselves to feel the feelings, at least to some extent. And then by looking at the fact, maybe has this happened to me at other times? And you might begin to see patterns
Mm.
when you do that. The other thing it asks you to do, which is actually connected with the patterns, is how much of what is upsetting me is about what really happened and
Mm.
how much is my interpretation, right? Because quite often we interpret other people's behavior according to our perceptual filters, which are patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
So
it seems like that
sometimes,
might be where those limiting beliefs pop up. So if we have a limiting belief that I'm never supported or I'm always inconveniencing people, this is one that
yeah.
I realize, then that becomes the lens that I see every situation through.
Yeah, exactly. And then so that's a really good example. So like when, for example, you might be not feeling well, or you might need a bit of support, and you know, you may be, I'm not trying to, you know, assume what you would do, but if you have that kind of core negative belief, you might be, would you be inclined not to ask for help maybe, or to try and battle it through on your own, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Exactly. Listen, I can
Or feel that I've
identify with that one.
inconvenienced somebody if I do need to bring up some sort of topic, like they might not
Yeah,
have time, or they might, I might
yeah,
make them feel bad about sharing what's going on in my life, and I don't
yeah.
want to make other people feel bad. So, right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So when we have those perceptions and interpretations, then we actually can color what happened
Mm-hmm.
according to our perceptions. So by looking at the patterns, as you say, the core negative beliefs are aspects of our patterns. I mean, a very simple one might be, that you're walking down the street and you see somebody not very well, but somebody quite well walking down the other way, and you wave over and smile and they don't smile back, or they ignore you. Okay. Now, if we're very sensitive, we have those perceptual filters, we have that kind of pattern of taking everything very personally that people do. It's because of me that they're like that. Then we think, oh, I must have offended them, or maybe they don't like me, or do I look strange, or is it my hair is weird, or whatever it is, okay, that we can interpret things according to our own perceptual filters. Now, in reality, that person, well, they may not have had their contact lenses in, they may not have seen us, or, right, they may be worried about something.
Preoccupied about, exactly.
Exactly, they may be in another world. So they may not even have registered that we were there.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they did, they'd something else going on. So we can very easily kind of color what people and what the world is doing by those perceptual filters. And again, as I said last time, I think, like the self-love, which is connected with it, I feel it's a gradual. I don't think we just suddenly kind of clear them all. But every time we feel triggered, we feel a charge around something that happens. And especially if it's something as minor as somebody ignoring you as you walk down the street. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that isn't really a major crisis, okay? But our reaction could be quite strong. I don't know if you've ever had that, where something that seems minor and you find yourself all worked up. Have you
Mm-hmm.
ever had that?
Oh yeah, I take things personally all the time. So.
Because sometimes we can handle the really tough stuff. It's amazing. But these small things seem to trigger us. And when those small things come up, that our reaction is way out of proportion to what's happened, then we know that's an opportunity. Rather than seeing that as a nuisance, that is actually an opportunity to do one of the tools, or and people may have other processes as well. Again, so it's not only radical forgiveness, loving kindness, meditation. There are many other
Mm-hmm.
processes people can use, but with radical forgiveness, that's the time you could do one of the processes. And I want to introduce everybody in a moment to a really quick one you can do in your head, okay, on the spot.
So
Okay,
are we
that you
ready
don't.
for that now? Would you like to do it?
Absolutely. All
Okay.
right. Okay. So it's a really, really good one. And what it now, I think by now we have, created the idea. And again, people don't have to subscribe to this concept, but that we are contributing to the experience of our lives in some way or another, that we are, if you like, co-creating. Right. So the first step in this is just a series of 4 lines. I can speak them out, and maybe then when you write on the video, you can just write them down for people.
Perfect.
I'd send them to you. Okay. And Colin calls this the 4 steps to radical forgiveness. It's so simple. I'll just say the lines and then I'll just explain them a little bit. And the first one is, look what I created. All right. And then the second one is, I notice my judgments and feelings and love myself anyway. So I notice my judgments and feelings and love myself anyway. Okay. Have you got that? The next one is, I am willing to see the perfection in the situation. I am willing to see the perfection in the situation. And then the final one is, I choose peace. Or you could say, I choose the power of peace. Very simple.
Wow.
And, it does actually contain the stages of radical forgiveness in a nutshell, as it were. So the one that can trip people up, especially if you're feeling bad, is, look what I created. Now, we're not saying it and saying, oh, there I go again, stupid me. It's not it's not really an opportunity to beat ourselves up. It's just acknowledging that even if the situation is something I don't like, that part of me has co-created this. all right, that I have some connection, that it's not happening to me. It's not like a meteor dropped out of the sky and hit me with this thing, okay? That I have some co-creative responsibility with this situation, even if it's a stranger being rude to me, okay? So look what I created. So it's not a stick to beat ourselves up with. And then I notice my judgments and feelings, because if we're triggered, we are feeling either upset or we're feeling judgmental. And it's okay to notice that. Okay. I mean, it's better, like especially in spiritual circles, there's a lot almost of judgment about being judgmental. Don't be judgmental. You mustn't be judgmental. And of course, we don't really want to be judgmental. But if the instinct is there to be judgmental, it's better to acknowledge it and notice it. Right? Because if we think we're not being judgmental, we're pushing it down further. Okay, so I notice my judgments and feelings and love myself anyway. And then I am willing to see the perfection in the situation. It doesn't mean that you necessarily see it right in the here and now, but I'm willing to see that there may be a perfection. And that perfection is on the level of our spiritual intelligence or our soul. It may not be perfect in terms of the human interaction. So I'm willing to see the perfection in the situation. And then the last one is I choose peace, or I choose the power of peace. It's really very beautiful. And it's one, like, as you see, it's very short. Until people know it, they can just write it down. But it's one very quickly, if you're using it, you'll have memorized it very quickly. And Colin introduced this. I mean, he's done workshops all over the world. And he said that he was doing workshops with business people in Switzerland, which meant that he went back the second time to the same group of business people, because he has a whole program for using radical forgiveness at work. And when he went back the second time, these very high-powered businessmen told him that particular process was the one they used most, and they found the most effective, because they could use it on the spot. They could use it at a board meeting in their head if somebody was annoying them. Or they could use it if, in situations where they wouldn't have time to get out a worksheet or to listen to the 13 steps. But if you know it in your head, then you can just be thinking it in your head. Obviously, you can speak it out loud if there's nobody around. But, you can think it in your head. And I had a client which came to me for some of my classes, and she went to a wedding. Now, weddings and Christmas are great opportunities for radical forgiveness. Okay. And she was at a wedding, and she said that there's a niece and herself that never really got on. They just read rags to each other's bull, that kind of energy. And so she saw her niece approaching or near, and she felt the familiar, oh, here she comes, And so she just started thinking this in her head. And she said it made a huge difference. She was actually able to let go of some of that charge. So that's a really quick and very useful process to use. I'm sure you can feel it.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I feel like just groundedness and peace. And again, it just brings me back to what I feel like you've been sharing the entire time, that everything that's happening in our life is actually happening for us, not to us.
Yeah.
And that shift in perspective, I think, is so powerful. And it's really, really tough to feel that when we're in the midst of the charge. But if there's something that we could go to, something we could memorize like this, or have on a note card or something like that, I just feel like it just brings us back home to peace, just to know that there's a reason. And if we can be patient and wait for the reason to make itself known, then for me, it just feels very peaceful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I mean, if it's a very charged situation, you can say it a few times in your head until you feel it. But it does definitely help. It helps to diffuse the situation. And you see, then the other thing that it helps is to start to move us from reaction to response. I'm sure you're aware of the difference. Maybe for our listeners, just to kind of explain that we're very programmed in our culture to be very reactive. That we react to things, right? Somebody says something and we're reacting. And it often doesn't end well when we're very reactionary, when we have a short fuse. I mean, it's very obvious if we know somebody who's got a very short temper, and you know that if as soon as you say anything, they're going to snap and they're going to blow a fuse, right? So, but most of us have a certain amount of reactionary energy. Now, when we move from reaction to response, then we're responding to the situation. We're coming from within ourselves, and quite often then we can actually handle the situation much better than if we're reacting. So even doing that little thing in your head, even if you can't remember all the words, just remember the concept of it, being willing, because it's the willingness to allow yourself to see this from the perspective maybe of your spiritual intelligence or yourself as the film director. It's that willingness that helps to just that moment of detaching a little bit from the situation and then being able to handle it much better. So I love sharing this one because so many people find it helpful. All right.
I think it moves me into a state of curiosity as well. Because it's way more fun if we'd be curious about why are these things happening in my life, and that level of curiosity. I agree with you. It's like being willing to, open to learn about what's going on, and then that just genuine curiosity about, what treasure is in this hard situation for me. So it's definitely a shift.
It definitely is. And most of us have, it's very much in our culture again, can have a tendency to take things very personally, and people's behavior, that it's all about us, or that, so our parent is in a bad humor because something we did, or our boyfriend or our husband isn't maybe he's very quiet at dinner, and then we assume it's something we did, and we sometimes forget to see the world from somebody else's perspective and realize that the person may have nothing to do with us. If somebody's quiet or if somebody just needs some space. So it's helping us not to take things so personally as well. I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 agreements. Most people have heard of the 4 agreements. And one of those is, don't take things so personally. Because in a real sense, nothing that anybody ever does is really because of us. It's because of what's going on within them, right, at some level. So anyway, I'm very happy to share that process with the group, with whoever's listening. It really works.
So there are 2 places I want to go from here, and I'll just share that, and then we can pick which one feels best for us. But one is really starting to look at how we can best support ourselves during difficult life situations. And then the other is, how can we be a support person and an encourager for someone in our life who's going through a difficult situation. And in particular with that one, my genuine interest is on, how can I be an encourager, but also not get wrapped up into that, what was the word that you used? The caretaker thing, because it's something I personally find myself in. So supporting ourselves and supporting others. If you want to pick which one feels best to start with, let's.
Right. Well, supporting ourselves, I suppose, because that actually helps us to support another anyway.
Perfect.
Right. Supporting ourselves. Well, I mean, obviously there are many things people can do, and there are many resources available to people apart from radical forgiveness. But in the radical forgiveness perspective, there can be just the willingness, when I feel a charge about anything, to be willing to look at one of the tools. I would encourage people to look at the worksheet, and there are worksheets, and there are some, Colin has done some webinars on those, and they are available. I think some of them are available on YouTube. So those to help us that when we feel charged, upset, angry, or guilty, if the upset is turned inward on ourselves, then to be willing to use one of the tools. They really do work.
Is there a particular tool that you recommend?
Particular?
Is there one specific worksheet that you think would be appropriate, or?
It depends on the situation. Maybe I'll just go through them, briefly. The first one, the main one, would be the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet. As we said in one of the earlier interviews, sometimes it's easier to start working on somebody else than on ourselves. So the Radical Forgiveness Worksheet, that's almost like the workhorse of radical forgiveness. It's a really good resource to have. And as I say, the explanation of it is on his website, and in the book he goes through a chapter. There's a whole chapter explaining how you fill it in. Or if anybody needs help with it, any of us radical forgiveness coaches are available to go through it with somebody, because sometimes that can help, to get more perspective on things. So there's the radical.
I'm so sorry. Can you tell
No,
me
go
if
on.
that particular worksheet is something you can do with a life situation, or is it just more focused on forgiving another person?
It can be on anything, and I'm
Okay.
glad you said that to me. Yeah, it can be obviously forgiving a person, but the line says the person or situation
Okay.
I'm having a problem with. So it could be if you're ill, if you've got a diagnosis, or your car's been, I don't know, stolen, or you've lost your job, or it can be anything that in your personal life that is upsetting you in some way. Okay, you may have, I mean, it could be extreme or it might be ordinary things. So the person or situation that is upsetting me right now. So as I say, it can be an illness, it can be like the lady you mentioned having an accident. So anything in your life that has upset you, basically. So yeah, so the radical forgiveness one, I would recommend it for people to download it, or if people can't find it for some reason, if they send me an email at my website, I can send it to them. So that's the radical forgiveness worksheet. Then there's the radical self-forgiveness worksheet, and they all bring us through those 5 stages. So the radical self-forgiveness, again, it's the emphasis as what I have trouble forgiving myself for. What am I beating myself up for? And one of the things it helps us to look at is to distinguish, is it guilt or shame? Or is there a bit of both? Because often if we have done something we regret, we can also interpret that as being something wrong with us, that we're bad. And, unintentionally, parents and adults can do this with children. If a child does something, oh, you're a bad boy, you're a bad girl. And it's like this advice that we get as parents and teachers is that you may not like the action, but you don't criticize or you don't dismiss the person. Now, it's taking a while for all of us to get that. But so the worksheet helps us begin to see, well, some of this is guilt and some of it is shame. And then it also helps us to look at, is some of this guilt appropriate or not? Again, if it's something that I deliberately did and it really hurt somebody, then there's an appropriate guilt. Now, it's not guilt that I'm going to beat myself up for the rest of my life, but it's a healthy regret where I actually acknowledge the fact that maybe I have done something that's inappropriate, and to the best of my ability, I might try and do something about it and learn from the situation. So it's not about beating myself up forever. But sometimes our guilt is inappropriate. And we've talked about that a few times. I remember at the end of the last interview when you mentioned something and I said, it's so easy for us to feel guilty or to feel responsible for something that really isn't our own responsibility. So you might begin to see that I'm feeling guilty here and really it wasn't my responsibility. If I was truthful with somebody and they got upset, maybe that isn't my responsibility, as long as I was basically kind. You don't have to be nasty. Okay, so there's the radical self-forgiveness worksheet. I would recommend both of those. And again, if people feel they need a bit of help, any of the radical forgiveness coaches, they're coaches in a lot of countries now, and it is nice to do it in person if there's a coach physically near you, or else it works quite well online as well. So that's the radical self-forgiveness, and that also includes, and then there's also another worksheet for self-acceptance, which helps us to look a little bit at how we look at ourselves and seeing the good aspects of ourselves as well. They're the two main ones that most of us use most of the time. Now, there's also an aspect of, like we generally say radical forgiveness, but the whole system, Colin calls it radical living,
Okay.
because we also have there's a whole area of manifestation which we won't have time to go through in this particular series, but if you're ever doing a series on manifestation, we might look into that.
Okay,
So
definitely.
radical manifestation, and there's a worksheet for that as well. Okay, so we won't have time to go into it now, but it's very very valid, and I've used it with good effect. Then the fourth section, which might fit into our topic today, is called radical transformation. And that actually fits in very well with the bigger picture of what you have put as the topic for this is life circumstances. And that is, when we're all looking around at the world, and especially I think in this day and age where there's internet and media, we're aware of things going on all over the world now, whereas our grandparents may not have been.
Mm-hmm.
And we can kind of, if we're looking at wars or we're looking at political unrest or all the issues you've had in your country that we've
Mm-hmm.
had in ours. And sometimes, I mean, we can either feel powerless or we can get angry. And, we see people getting very angry and wanting something to be done about it. And it's very easy to get into the victimizer mindset, about political figures or about, I mean, some of the awful situations that you've had in your country recently, or that, we can kind of get angry and blame
Mm-hmm.
and feel that, the only way to do something about it is to get angry and make people do things and change the laws. And, very little ever changes by changing laws.
Mm.
Okay. I mean, really very little on that level. Now, what radical transformation helps us to become a bit more empowered about it. Now, I can remember years ago, my very first meditation teacher used to say that the government is the reflection of the consciousness of the people,
Mm.
right? And that always resonated with me. So that, not just the government, but the community, the world we live in, we're not separate from the world we live in. We are a part of it. We are an intrinsic part. And if you have a society where there's a significant amount of people, for example, who are angry or who are bigoted, then that is bound to outpicture in terms of the events that happen in the society or the country, right? Depending on the consciousness of the people. And so we all have a part to play in the consciousness of the world around us. We are not separate from the world. We are not innocent bystanders, and we're not victims.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can choose to be victims if we want to, but if we begin to accept that if something upsets us, because if you watch, say if you were watching the news and there were 3 or 4 bad news stories, 1 or 2 of them might affect you more than others. I'm sure you've noticed that, but
Mm-hmm.
I have. That you might, like some people might be more upset at seeing something about children,
Mm.
or again about what's happened in your country with schools and all of that. Other people might be more upset about what's happening in politically, or they might be more upset about something to do with the environment. Okay, so we will all respond emotionally differently to different stories and feel connections with different stories. Now, what the radical transformation, and maybe that's the process I do today, then I think that's good. The radical transformation helps us to begin to see that if something upsets us in the world out there, that there's some of that energy signature in us.
Mm.
So, for example, even if we take something like violence or abuse, okay, and say even if something like abuse against women or against children or whatever. Now, on one level, of course, we may not like to admit that we may feel that we would never do that, okay? But on another level, we may be denying something in ourselves. For example, if say if get very upset about women's rights or abuse of women. Now it's not right that these things happen, but are we denying our own female side? Are we crushing the feminine within ourselves? That can be
Mm-hmm.
male or female. How do we get on with other women in our lives? Right? Can there often be, I mean, even among women, there can be tremendous competitiveness, right? So how do we treat the women in our lives, ourselves? Okay, so we may have a touch, it may not be as magnified as what we see in the world around us, but do we have parts of that energy in ourselves? And we have the ability and actually the responsibility to acknowledge that is there a bit of that in me that I'm not
Mm-hmm.
looking at? And by doing that, we're actually helping to lessen the intensity of that particular signature in the world. Okay, so it's actually a very empowering thing to do, so that anytime we do get upset, that there's something we can do about it. And it doesn't mean that we don't act. I mean, if we feel we need to do some, like raise awareness or run a campaign or whatever, we can still do that, but without the charge of it's them, they're the ones who are doing it. I mean, if you imagine watching 3 sets of protesters, right? And you don't know what they're protesting about. They're just marching, and you don't see their placards. But if you see three, now you could have a really strong racist group, okay, and you could have maybe people about the environment, and then you could have somebody else for what I mean, maybe against or organic what you call them, GMOs or whatever it might be. Okay, now you could have or against a vegetarians. Okay, you could have vegetarians against meat eating or whatever. Now, if you saw those 3 groups marching and protesting and you didn't know what they were protesting about, it's very likely you wouldn't know which was which. Because if they're angry, if they're protesting, if there's a fight for peace, people say, I'm going to fight for peace, but that's actually a contradiction. All right, because you can't, so sometimes we can get the impression that we're helping, going up and protesting for peace or protesting for animal welfare or whatever. But if there isn't a certain balance in ourselves, we're actually creating more of a polarity than we are actually helping to heal the situation. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Yes, and
Yeah,
something
yeah,
that came to mind as you were speaking
yeah.
earlier was, you mentioned like paying attention to the kinds of things that trigger us on the news, for say, like with the whole like potential violence against children or
Yeah. Mm.
um, women, and then seeing what's inside of ourselves. Is that I've noticed over the years that dreams have helped to illuminate that for me, because
Right.
I don't watch the news. It doesn't make me feel good, and so I
Mm.
generally trust if something really important is going on in the world, then people are going to be
Mm.
talking about it, and I'll hear about it
Yes.
and look it up. But
Mm.
my
Mm.
dreams have very often shown me areas of my own life that I've disowned or that I'm not
Yeah.
paying attention to. So it's interesting to me as you bring all that up that there's so many ways I think that our higher self communicates with us, and that might be a trigger toward the news or something that somebody says to us or a story that we hear. But
Yeah.
they're just beautiful about.
It is because it's very easy, and we'll get on to the process now because we don't have this too long. But it's very easy for us to get on our high horse about things,
Mm-hmm.
to get up on our high horse about what they're doing or what other people are doing. And, I mean, they are doing things, of course, but if we are approaching them as we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, then that's a polarity, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily helping. I've seen this happening in spiritual groups. I've seen it happening in people who are aware of maybe political agendas and things like that, that there's always the good guy, there's often this good guy,
Mm-hmm.
bad guy. And usually the people, when we get into those mindsets, it's very easy for us to think we're the good guys because we see what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I mean, it does require a certain amount of self-honesty and humility, but I do feel that it's very powerful. And not for any of us to underestimate the power that we have by attending our own gardens. Now, not ignoring the world, but attending our own gardens and
Mm-hmm.
maintaining our own energy signature as high as it can. There was a man called David Hawkins who did something called the scale of consciousness, and people can check him out if they like. But he did a scale of consciousness using kinesiology, and he found that the frequency or the energy signature of different emotional states was obviously different. And for example, anger and jealousy had quite a low frequency, a heavy energy. Kindness and forgiveness, higher. Love, and then there's like ordinary love, if you like, and then there's the higher love, and then there was peace, and they were higher and higher frequency. And according to the work he did, people who embodied a higher level of frequency had a much more significant effect on the world around them, even if they did nothing on the surface, because
Mm-hmm.
the frequency, it's like when you put two tuning forks of similar frequency, they actually vibrate together. So there's a lot about that by coming more and more into our peace, not peace in the sense of the absence of war, but a genuine peace, which can also include being peaceful with our own shadow. And the
Mm-hmm.
more and more we become into that integration, we actually can contribute in a very real way. We may not have to be doing something very, very overtly out in the world. We may be, depending on our purpose, but we can actually make a big contribution by the frequency and by the energy we hold. Okay. All right. So it's very empowering. in lots of ways. Okay, so maybe it's time to do this
Let's
process.
do
And,
it.
and if there's nothing else, is there anything else? Maybe when we
No,
do
before
this, we'll
we end,
see.
I would like to go back to the question of how do we support others who are having difficult life
Oh, yes.
situations. But I think we should do the process now. It feels right to do that.
Right. Well, I mean, just for a minute, obviously, the more we nurture our own selves, the more in position we're going to be for other
Mm-hmm.
people. Often what we do is listen and be present, not try to fix them, right? Let them, if you think of what's helped you, I'm speaking to our listeners as well as you, what's helped you during difficult times, right? Think of it like that. It's often been somebody who was there for you, didn't try to fix you, didn't try to come up with a dozen solutions, maybe listened as you try to work it out for yourself, right? Came to your own conclusions, supported you. Often that can actually be more supportive than coming in like Robin Hood to the rescue. you know, because you're allowing them. I mean, I have treasured that so much when people have done that for me, where I've been going through a tough time, that I know that they understand, that they're supportive, but they're not trying to fix me according to their particular perspective.
Right. It seems like they trust that you have the right path
Yeah.
inside of you. So they just
Yeah.
hold support for you while you figure that out yourself.
Or even to convey to them that you do trust them, that I know that at some level you know what to do. And I'm here for you if you need me, but, giving people space as well. I actually think listening and being present is a huge help to people. And the more we have done our own work and the more peaceful we are in ourselves, the more we're able to offer that to somebody else. So that's what I would say. It's not necessarily what we do, but the presence we offer. Right. And then we can always, if you say, for example, as radical forgiveness, you felt they might like it, then you can mention it to them. Right. Or whatever else we're doing. But the main thing, I've certainly have been when I've been at the receiving end of the support that's meant the most to me, it's that somebody capacity to listen, to be present, to, I'd feel compassion, but I wouldn't feel hurried. And ironically, when you're not hurried, quite often you come to the solution more quickly. It's ironic, isn't it? As much of life. Okay, so this again is another of the 13-step processes. And in our own mind, we can do the first bit. And what we're going to do at the very end, it's a very nice, it's called the Radical Forgiveness Invocation. And it's suggested that you say it out loud. Now, I'll just read it slowly. And if people, when they're listening to this, want to say it out loud, you don't have to, if you want to see, first of all, what it's saying. But people listening to it the second time might just like it, okay? All right, so in your own mind, describe what is happening in the world out there that is upsetting to you. And it wouldn't be something that impacts you personally. It's what's out there in the world. So describe what is happening in the world out there that is upsetting to you. It'll take a few minutes. And become aware of the judgments you have about it and the knee-jerk reactions that immediately come to mind when you first heard about it. Become aware of the feelings you have about this. Point to the place in your body where the feelings seem to be located. Do you realize that your upset may be a direct reflection of something that needs to be healed within you? And that even if you cannot see it yet, there may be a healing message contained in the situation? Yes.
Yes.
Are you willing to see that what is occurring out there is a reflection of yours and everyone else's consciousness at this time? And that this may be an opportunity for us all to move beyond the illusion and shift our perception of what is real? Yes.
Yes.
Can you be open to the idea that this situation is totally purposeful in the grand scheme of things, and that what you judge about the situation and find unacceptable is exactly what is called for in the divine plan? Yes.
Yes.
Are you willing to release your need to judge the situation as right or wrong, good or bad? Yes.
Yes.
Even if you cannot explain how or why, can you simply allow the situation to be perfect, just the way it is? Yes.
Yes.
If this situation is causing people and animals to be hurt, killed, or to suffer in some way, while you feel empathy and compassion for them, can you be open to the idea that their own spiritual journey included having this experience and is or was, in that sense, perfect for them and all part of their own divine plan? Yes.
Yes.
Are you able to feel a sense of gratitude towards those who appear to be suffering in this situation, for being willing to choose this situation so that we might be forced to grow and learn, wake up, and raise our level of awareness? Yes.
Yes.
Are you willing to see this situation as an opportunity to choose love and to send love? Yes.
Yes.
If there is an opportunity to offer practical help in order to alleviate the pain and suffering, are you willing to do so with your consciousness focused exclusively on peace and love? Yes.
Yes.
Nod your head yes when the feelings you had at the beginning have begun to subside, and that you are now beginning to feel the divine love behind the apparent situation. And then listen to the radical forgiveness invocation to complete the process. The radical forgiveness invocation. May we all stand firm in the knowledge and comfort that all things are now, have always been, and forever will be in divine order, unfolding according to a divine plan. And may we truly surrender to this truth, whether we understand it or not. May we also ask for support in consciousness, in feeling our connection with the divine part of us, with everyone and with everything, so we can truly say and feel, we are one.
It's interesting because what came up for me during that was a release around the situation I was asking about. So I was asking very generally about how to support others when they're having a tough time, and yeah, I love that idea that anything happening is for our soul's growth. So to remind ourselves when a friend or loved one is going through a tough time and we don't really know how to support them,
Yeah,
but there's a part of them that chose that, even if they don't feel that way in the moment, and that they do have the answer. So it makes a lot of sense. It makes more sense now what you were saying about
that's
just
great.
being there to listen. And
Just being there, and and also like not, when even if it's obvious to us that there is a higher purpose, it
mm-hmm.
they need to come to that themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I remember actually Colin Tipping does if you find his page on Facebook, he's doing a weekly broadcast now, which is actually very nice. And I remember after the recent school shootings that you had in Florida, and somebody asked him, should they, should they kind of share the radical forgiveness processes with the parents or the families of the children? And he said, not at all. That's not the time. Like that, we allow people, we support people in their grief, or when they're having their tough time. And it's only, we'll know intuitively if we're sensitive when it may be appropriate to bring in, maybe there's another way of looking at it. But like I've seen people, and I've done it myself before I became a little bit more aware and mature, that when we can see that somebody else is going through a tough time, and it's very easy to say, oh, well, there's a higher purpose to that. And it can actually sound a bit dismissive and as if we're not being sensitive to them. I'm not saying that you do it, but I've seen it happening so often that, being completely present with somebody if they're upset or if they're lonely, that actually will be more healing for them. And actually, as I said earlier, sometimes it allows them to move through it more quickly, because sometimes we just want somebody to allow us to be what we are right now. And that can be the greatest gift we can give to somebody. Okay, so.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that there are moments when, like, if I think I'm trying to help someone else, I'm really just not being. It's almost as if I think the other person's making me uncomfortable, and I feel that when I'm in the other situation. If they're not able to sit with that and be present with me, I usually feel it's because what I'm sharing makes them uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the best things that we can do is just to sit with our helplessness over others, our helplessness over situations, and to feel our own feelings of discomfort instead of thinking that by fixing the other person that we don't have to feel comfortable. So we don't have to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Misty. And I actually feel that the more comfortable, if you're using that term, we are with the full spectrum of who we are, then we're more able to be present with people. Because, for example, as you say, if people are going through a tough time, let's say if it's grief, and if we're not comfortable with grief, or if we haven't embraced our own grief or whatever, then we will feel very uncomfortable and we'll try to shortchange it and short circuit it in some way for them, or cheer them up. Make a cup of tea and cheer them up and tell them a joke. And sometimes that's appropriate, but not always. Whereas if the more we have gone into both our depth and our height, as it were, like if you think of a piano keyboard, the more we've gone into our low notes and our high notes, and we can, the fullness of our being embraces both the light and the shadow, then we're not as threatened by other people's pain and other people's grief or anger or whatever it might be. And I think, because when I've been in the presence of someone like that, when they're comfortable with it, they're not judging. There's a tremendous compassion, because you're in the presence of someone. They may not have had the same story, the same outer story, but they understand the feeling. And I think that's a tremendous gift to give to somebody. So again, becoming more and more realistic about ourselves, and that actually helps our presence. There's a really nice, and we won't have time to read it now, but I'm sure you've nearly all read that quote from Marianne Williamson. The one, our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, it is that we are powerful beyond measure. And as she says at the end of that, and as we let our own light shine, our presence automatically liberates others. It's something like that. But it's not just our light, it's our full being, I think. And that frees other people to just relax a bit. And often integration can happen. It's actually more about integrating necessarily than healing, because sometimes healing implies there's something wrong. Whereas when we're talking about integrating, we're meaning kind of being, integrating the fullness of who we are, which includes all of the good and the bad, the light and the shadow, the white and the black, if you like. So, okay.
Well, I want to thank you, Rose. Having these 3 conversations with you have been so eye-opening.
It's been an absolute joy, and thank you for the opportunity as well.
We'll include links to Rose's information if you want to reach out to her for any support, as well as the radical forgiveness worksheets and all the things that we've talked about. And I want to encourage you, if you've enjoyed this video and you want to join us for a series just like these, please subscribe to the Love Letter, which is my monthly newsletter, and Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.